Thanks all for coming back from morning tea. It's great to see you all buzzing and catching up with each other. We're delighted this morning to have Minister Chris Bishop come and join us and talk with us. And very warm welcome to you, Chris. Thanks for coming back to the conference. You were at the conference last time in Otautahi. It's great to see you back again, and we really do feel privileged to have you here with us. But before we do that, I just want, on behalf of the community housing sector, to offer our heartfelt thanks to Andrew Crisp. As Chief Executive of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, you've done a really good 6 years of hard work there, building something from nothing. And please show your appreciation for Andrew and his work. So last night, for those of you who didn't pick it up in the media, there was a bit of a community housing event. It was a real privilege, actually, just a week or two ago to attend an event hosted by the Minister of Finance, Nicola Willis, on the occasion of the establishment of the new Social Investment Agency. So we all need to be thinking quite deeply as we pivot and as we learn as community housing providers to do more with less resource, to innovate, to collaborate, to embrace a place-based approach, to think about what that looks like in any given place, because it's always going to be different where there's a different need and persistent unmet need. The supply side solutions might look different, the partners might look different. And in a sort of toitu te tiriti environment, we might need to think about how we're partnering up between mainstream chips and local Māori and iwi providers as well. So just some challenges there for all of us as we look to the future and look to deliver more of the services that we do to the people who need them most. And so that was an awesome launch of a new agency, the Social Investment Agency, and last night we launched the Community Housing Funding Agency, which is aiming to deliver more efficient finance into new housing supply. So exciting times. Hopefully we can compete with each other to do more. Minister Bishop, no mai, haere mai, it's a real pleasure to have you here at the CHAR conference. Welcome.
Well, good morning everyone. It's great to be here at the Community Housing Aotearoa conference. Great to see so many people here, sellout crowd, Paul tells me. Great to see so many people here dedicated to solving New Zealand's housing crisis. So just want to acknowledge you, Paul, and also Andrew, who's done, as Paul says, 6 years as the inaugural Chief Executive of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, and is moving on to brighter and better things, where he will also be focused on solving some of New Zealand's most endemic social problems. I also want to congratulate CHAR on celebrating 20 years of serving people in need, and he's looking forward to 20 more years. I'd like to start also by thanking you all in this room. Community housing providers around New Zealand are doing a great job providing warm, dry homes for people in need, affordable rentals, social support, and so much more. So thank you for all that you do every day to make New Zealand a better place. Today I want to talk about this government's vision for housing, and in particular social housing. This government believes in social housing, and we believe in the community housing sector. We intend to back you to succeed. Before I get on to social housing, I do want to talk about our wider housing crisis and what we're doing about it. And it sort of bugs me a little bit that sometimes people try and segment the housing market and say, over here we've got social and affordable housing in its own little bucket, and pretend that we can kind of divorce all that from the rest of the housing system. The truth is we can't do that. Our failure to create a functioning housing market has created a cascading series of very difficult and expensive public policy problems, and those public policy problems have a real human cost. You all know the stats, so I don't want to dwell on them too much, but after inflation, house prices in New Zealand increased by more than any other OECD country in the last 30 years. Between 2000 and 2021, inflation-adjusted house prices in New Zealand rose 256%. That is a staggering number. In the year to June last year, 45% of renting households spent at least 30% of their post-tax income on housing. Research by the OECD shows that this is even higher for low-income households, and it is higher in New Zealand than in any other country. there are around 21,000 families on the social housing wait list. And as you will all know so well, over the last few years we have seen the human disaster that is emergency housing, where in 2022 the government was spending around $1 million on average per day to house people in motels around the country. Our housing crisis is phenomenally expensive for government. Central government spends around $5 billion every year on housing assistance in its many different forms. That includes the accommodation supplement, income-related rent, emergency housing grants, transitional housing, and initiatives to address homelessness. Each new government program over the years has begat another government program, and they've grown like mushrooms. The system is complicated, opaque, duplicative, and expensive. And to put the $5 billion number into context, if that amount stayed flat, over a 4-year budget period, we would spend, as a government, $20 billion just on helping people to be housed. To put that in perspective, that is 15 transmission gully motorways in 4 years. It's 2/3 of central government's school property portfolio, and in fact, billions of dollars more than our entire network of hospitals. So it is an astonishing amount of money. But it's not just about the fiscals, as important as that is. Our housing crisis is most importantly a moral issue. A generation locked out of home ownership, kids growing up in motels, families living paycheck to pay the rent, a long list of families in housing need who can't get access to a warm, dry home. All of our problems in housing are connected to each other, and our government is determined to fix the housing crisis by focusing on the fundamentals. So our Going for Housing Growth policy, which I'll talk more about in a moment, improving the rental market, changes to building and construction, reforming our planning laws, and improving social housing. Tomorrow marks the anniversary of the government's first year in office. You've probably seen a bit of media around it. And I'm pleased with the progress we've made so far in housing. We are ending the blight that is emergency housing. The latest reporting shows that there are only 993 households in emergency housing around the country. That's down from 3,400 when we came to government. It's a 70% decrease. This has come from a sustained focus by MSD workers on getting our most vulnerable people into houses, either social houses or private rentals. We campaigned on a thing called Priority One, which is a simple concept, which is that there should be no kids in emergency housing. And if you're a kid growing up in a motel, you should go to the front of the wait list to get into a house, because the last thing this country should want to do is fund families, and often quite young children, to live in grotty motel rooms. That's our simple view. So we implemented this policy called Priority One. We campaigned on it. It took effect from April this year. 1,600 kids have moved out of motels into housing thanks to Priority One. I'm really proud of that. The public housing register is down to around 21,000, still way too high obviously, but it's 4,000 fewer than it was a year ago. In building and construction, you'll have seen some of the work I suspect Chris Penk's making around making it easier to build. We're reforming the building consent system, removing barriers to overseas building products, increasing the use of remote inspections, and a whole lot more, which I won't dwell on. We're also changing the law to make it easier to build granny flats of up to 60 square metres without a building consent or a resource consent. It's been extraordinarily popular, and we've just released the submission document around that, and we'll take policy decisions to implement that next year. The centrepiece of our housing policy is called Going for Housing Growth, and it focuses on the 3 pillars that address the root cause of our housing crisis: freeing up land for development and removing unnecessary planning barriers, improving infrastructure funding and financing, and incentives for communities and councils. Report after report has shown that our planning system, particularly restrictions on the supply of urban land and infill opportunities, are at the heart of our housing affordability challenge. And if you doubt that, I'd encourage you to read a report that just came out in the last couple of days or so by a couple of urban economists who've looked at the experience of Auckland after the Auckland Unitary Planned upzoning of 2016, which has made an appreciable and demonstrable difference to housing supply in Auckland, and lowered rents put downward pressure on rents so that they are lower than they otherwise would be without the effect of upzoning. The first pillar of Going for Housing Growth has been announced, and it involves the establishment of housing growth targets for Tier 1 and 2 councils, new rules to make it easier for cities to expand outwards at the urban fringe, and strengthening of the intensification provisions in the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, new rules requiring councils to enable mixed-use development in our cities, and the abolition of minimum floor areas and balcony requirements. In essence, we are doubling down on the planning approach of the previous government and supplementing it with sensible rules to allow cities to grow out at the fringe and also up. And I see the Honourable Kieran McAnulty is here, Labor spokesperson for local government and housing. And I want to acknowledge the continuity between the previous government's approach around the National Policy Statement on Urban Development devised by Phil Twyford and this government. The NPSUD was a good start, actually revolutionary in some senses to tackling our housing crisis, and we are now being additive to that, more mixed use, more use of rapid transit, more use of densification around rapid transit, supplementing the rules that already work and making sure they work even more effectively. And allied to that and complementary to that, we are making it clear that cities have to grow. Our cities have to allow more housing. The greatest challenge facing this country, in my view, is housing, and our housing policies will go a long way to addressing it. So that deals with the land supply challenges. Pillar 2 is about infrastructure funding and financing for urban growth, and that's very important because it's all very well to upzone land and allow cities to grow, but you've got to fund the infrastructure and finance the infrastructure to enable those houses to be built. So we're doing a lot of work on that, and I'll have more to say on that very soon. Let me talk about social housing. One of the first things we did on coming to government was commission an independent review into Kāinga Ora. We were worried about it in opposition, and we were right to be worried about it. Kāinga Ora had extraordinary access to money under the last government. It had easy access to debt, hundreds of millions of dollars allocated to it, and it was asked to do everything from urban development, infrastructure grants, shared equity, first home grants, specified development projects, as well as being a landlord and look after tenants, which was actually its core job. Despite billions thrown at it and billions borrowed, the wait list quadrupled over the last few years. As you know, there's a new board in place at Kāinga Ora, and the first thing we did was ask for a turnaround plan. Last week we received that plan. It is critical that Kāinga Ora is a highly performing organisation, not just for the Crown's books, but for the people it houses and for the communities it operates in. Once Cabinet's considered the plan, we'll release it publicly and the next steps for Kāinga Ora. In the meantime, we know that it's really important to keep the momentum around social housing going, keep the construction going. The previous government's 3,000 new social housing places involved funding until June next year, June 2025. So in this year's budget, we allocated $140 million to new social housing places, $140 million, to be delivered only by the community housing sector. This was funded from ending the First Home Grant Scheme, which is a classic example of this government's modus operandi, which is reprioritising low-value expenditure and making it, reprioritising it to higher value expenditure. Back in May, I signalled that around 500 homes of these new 1,500 would be allocated quickly based on the existing pipeline to maintain momentum. And as of last month, around 100 social housing places have either been approved or are in the final stages of consideration. And my officials who are here with me today tell me there's a strong pipeline of proposals coming through, which is great to see. Of the remaining 1,000 places, we're going to allocate these using strategic partnerships with the aim of targeting areas where the need is most acute. And emergency housing obviously factors into that needs-based approach. Under this new approach, strategic partners will be funded to deliver social housing at a portfolio level, as opposed to looking at them one by one, which is basically what we do at the moment. These long-term strategic partnerships will help build sector capacity and capability. I think it's really important. MHUD has selected a small number of CHIPs to start work on strategic partnerships, and a formal announcement of the strategic partners will be made once those agreements have been confirmed. I do want to stress, though, that while most of these 1,500 places will be delivered through either the maintaining momentum or the strategic partnerships buckets, there's still going to be room for CHIPs to deliver projects outside of these buckets. Let me talk now about ambition for social housing. My ambition for the social housing system is to create a level playing field between CHIPS and Kāinga Ora. Put it this way, I don't care who builds social houses as long as they are built. I think it's fair to say the last government had a real preference for state housing. They're obsessed with state housing. I am obsessed with building houses across the continuum for people who need them. I am agnostic as to whether those houses are delivered by community housing providers or the government. The simple truth is this: we will not solve our housing crisis by the government alone. I call this competitive neutrality. In some areas and for some people, community housing providers are the answer. In other areas, Kāinga Ora is the way to go. But we don't have competitive neutrality right now. As I'm sure you're aware, Kāinga Ora can borrow at a small margin above the Crown's cost of financing, while CHIPS effectively get access to finance only at commercial rates. So over the last year, I've heard from many of you, heard from the major banks, intermediaries and investors that access to finance is a real concern for CHIPS. And I want to give the sector assurance that the government has heard you and we are committed to levelling that playing field. So today I'm proud to announce 3 actions the government is taking right now to help CHIPS access borrowing to deliver new social housing. The first is making the operating supplement available up front. So to improve the confidence of the delivery of the 1,500 places, the government is going to make $70 million of operating supplement available up front that would otherwise be paid to CHIPS over time. The purpose of this upfront funding is to unlock the equity CHIPS require to raise debt finance where they otherwise wouldn't have been able to. For example, I know that it's difficult in some regional locations to get financing where banks may require more equity. So ultimately, this will mean more community housing projects meet financing criteria and those projects can be advanced more quickly. The second change is to income-related rent subsidy contracts. So I've directed the Ministry to make targeted changes to IRRS contracts for new housing supply that make the revenue stream more attractive for financiers. There are several clauses in HUD's contracts that investors repeatedly emphasise as problematic. These add to the perceived risk of transactions and therefore increase the cost of financing or deter investors altogether. There are also some operational measures that HUD has identified to help mitigate some of the cash flow risks that investors have identified. So officials will be following up with CHIPS in the coming months on these, but you have my commitment that we will make those operational changes, and I think that will make a difference. The third short-term change is around leasing. So on top of the IRRS, we really need to change that word, by the way. On top of the IRRS contract changes, I've also instructed the Ministry to review the use of leasing to provide social housing in cases where it provides value for money. There is significant interest from private developers and investors in partnering with CHIPS to help them deliver and operate social housing. Over the coming months and into the new year, the Ministry will review and reset its framework for leasing. There are many leasing terms and structures. The Ministry's framework will consider what happens at the end of the lease term and what the options are for CHIPS and for government and for the tenants at that stage. Let me now talk briefly about the Reserve Bank. We've also heard what CHIPS have said around Reserve Bank rules. Broadly, we agree with you and we think that the risk weights that the Reserve Bank applies may be overcooked for lending for social housing. The Minister of Finance is soon going to request that the Reserve Bank undertake a review of standardised risk weights, including prioritising work on lending for social housing. Over time, and as the social housing sector grows, there's the potential for changes through that review to increase competition and place pressure on the cost in terms of debt financing. But banks are not the only source of debt financing for CHIPS or their partners. In other jurisdictions, financing for the operating phase tends to come from lenders that can be more flexible to meet the needs of the sector, such as capital markets. This is an area where I'm seeing a lot of potential for growth and for innovation. And that brings me to my next announcement. I'm pleased to announce today that the government is committed to exploring a credit enhancement intervention for CHIPS so they can access suitable debt. Over the next 3 to 4 months, the government will consider a range of options to support CHIPS access to debt on terms reflective of their real risk and circumstance. These options include, but are not limited to, providing direct lending or guarantees to CHIPS, establishing a Crown intermediary to provide financing efficiencies, or providing lending or guarantees to a private lender. CHIPS having access to financing that is not unnecessarily restrictive gives them a stronger economic case for building more social houses and will go some way to levelling the playing field with Kāinga Ora. The days of the state preferring its own entity are over. But I want to be blunt with you, this work is going to take some time. It's very complicated and there are many details to comb through. We want to get it right. So I've requested that the Treasury, with support from the Ministry of Housing, Urban Development, report back to ministers early next year with details on a fulsome credit enhancement proposal for consideration next year. So, I don't know when your conference is next year, Paul, probably around the same time, but I'm hopeful I'll be able to report back on even more progress next year. Depending on what it looks like, it may also take a bit of time to implement. I'm being realistic about timelines, because politicians always overpromise. So I'm being realistic about it, because I don't want you to wait for the crown and put a brake on the momentum that the chip sector has. I want you to get on with it. But the work is underway around credit enhancement. I'm coming to the end of my time with you this morning. I think we're taking some questions. I'm looking forward to those. But I know you're probably wondering what's happening to the rest of the Kāinga Ora review recommendations around active purchasing and the review of housing funds and community housing associations. I've got to be honest with you, our major focus this year has been to reset the organisation. It's been really important. At the same time, as I think some of you know, we also started a comprehensive look at all of the funds the government has across the housing system. That's that $5 billion amount I talked about before. What is clear to me is that the system is messy, opaque, expensive and duplicative. My view is we can create better institutional structures that enable investment discipline and certainty. We can create simpler and clearer funding streams for CHIPS and Kāinga Ora to access. And we can be far more deliberate about where and when we invest, based on much greater use of granular data about housing and social need, particularly in our regions. So that work is coming together and I'll have more to say about it in the new year. Can I just conclude by finishing where I started my remarks to you today, which is saying thank you for what you do. It's a great privilege to hold the role of Minister of Housing and I've got a few other portfolios as well, but my favourite one is housing, because housing is at the centrepiece of so much of what is wrong in New Zealand, but it's also at the centre of what can be right about New Zealand. We want warm, dry homes that everybody can access, whether they're private homes or market rentals or social and affordable houses, and you all have a really important role to play in creating the New Zealand that we all want to live in. Thank you very much.
Any questions from the please, Conrad?
I just wanted to drill down on one of the things that you said. You said that the $70 million available for capitalisation of the operational supplement.
Yep.
One would assume that the majority of that would go to your strategic partners that you get to announce. But would you also expect that a portion of that capitalisation fund would also go out to the regions and play around the edges, as I think you mentioned earlier?
Short point is yes. The officials will be working their way through that. There'll be opportunities for that, absolutely. So the officials will be working through the precise details of that, and they'll be engaging with CHAR and with you all around that. But the short point is yes.
Another question. You're being so good. What's going on here?
Several questions come from me.
Oh, I'm sorry, I haven't got that. Would you mind reading one out?
This question from Matthew Cutler-Welsh. Kāinga Ora developed quality plans for standard plans for healthy, low-carbon homes. Does the government see any value in all the work that has been done to put that still be used?
I mean, to some extent, we've asked Kāinga Ora to really focus on reducing the cost of construction, okay? So one of the reasons why we've been quite critical about Kāinga Ora is the cost of the homes that they've constructed, which ultimately taxpayers pay for, right? So ultimately the government pays for that, taxpayers pay for all of those houses, and by making them as efficient and effective to deliver as possible, you can do more with the same money. You can do more with less. Where that stuff makes sense, sure, but our absolute focus is on reducing the cost to deliver new houses. That is the overriding focus for Kāinga Ora, and you'll see that in the turnaround plan. Kāinga Ora homes are more expensive than equivalent houses delivered through the private sector. That is the truth. And it shouldn't be like that. It should, if anything, it should be the reverse. Because Kāinga Ora has economies of scale and is a large monopsonistic buyer. But they're not. They're more expensive. So you've got to ask yourself why that is.
Another one that came in is your community and Maori providers provide a range of tenures.
Yeah.
And one of those is the shared equity, a proven model
Yeah.
of getting people into homes affordably. Do you see a return to this model using some of the measures you've announced today?
Yeah, so that's part of what we're looking at as part of the review of the housing funds. So, across the $5 billion, you've got all of these programs, right, from accommodation supplement, income-related rents. The last government had, for a short period of time, the Affordable Rental Fund, progressive home ownership, but there were 3 different progressive home ownership schemes. One was run by Kāinga Ora. There were 2 other types run through MHUD. So there's a whole lot of different Maori housing funds and initiatives as well. Extremely complicated funding streams, to be honest, through the Crown accounts. You've got the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund, you've got the Housing Infrastructure Fund, which the last national government set up, which is still running. So honestly, when you look at the list, it's like a long list and they're very complicated. Our view is that there's got to be room for rationalisation and simplification. So we're having a look at that. And then we're trying to look at what the best use of that money is. So I don't want to get ahead of where we're going to get to and cabinet decisions and things like that. But I'll have more to say about it in the new year. But I think there is a role for a variety of housing options around the continuum, because if you look at it, the great challenge is in the middle between income-related rent, social housing, and market rentals. That's the great challenge, right? So if you're in an income-related rent house, either KO or a chip house, almost certainly you're on 25% of your income. So you're not paying a lot. The delta's topped up by the government. But if you try and leave, you go into a market rental situation, chances that you can afford that are extremely low. The gap is in the middle around affordable rentals. So without getting too ahead of where we're going, that gives you a bit of a sense about what I'm interested in.
At the back there.
Good morning. Just a question. I noticed the new funding is for new builds, and my query is with the staffing shortage. My understanding is there's not funding for current housing that might be available. Is that correct?
Yes, our focus is on new builds for precisely the reason you adverted to in your first clause, which is that there's a housing crisis. Our housing crisis will not be solved without building more houses. So I don't make any apologies for it. We have an absolute focus on building more houses. We need thousands and thousands of houses built each and every year around the country for years and years and years and years. And as I say, I'm agnostic as to who builds them. The government's got a role, CHIPS have got a role, iwi have got a role, the private sector's got a role. Most houses in New Zealand are built by the private sector, by the way. Built by developers putting their own money behind making a buck out of a housing development. And that's a good thing. We need to make it easier for them to build. We need more apartments, we need more duplexes, we need more terraced houses, we need more mansions, we need small 1-bedroom granny flats, we need more 1- and 2-bedroom units that seniors can live in. We need all of the above. Every bit counts. Every bit counts. So I kind of get frustrated when people say, oh yeah, that housing development's good, but there's no affordable houses in the housing development, or there should be sort of mandatory social housing requirements in each development. We do need more social housing, but most importantly, cascade up a touch, most importantly, we just need more houses. And every house that is built houses someone, and that's important.
Ministers, I'm sorry, I've just got one last question here because the Minister and the team need to go to see how we can build more houses for residential construction.
I've got more time. Let's do it. I'm enjoying this. Yeah.
This one is, it would be good to get your take on the recent water care announcements and also with respect to weather and blue zones. So, I mean, I work for an organisation that delivers a couple of hundred affordable and first homes for people, whether they be choice or private developers and mum and dads. And with the recent announcements in the last week, there are many projects that I'm involved with at the moment, literally hundreds of houses that are now on hold, where chips, people in this room, and private developers, some of them are mum and dads, have invested six-figure sums in trying to get projects across the line. We have resource consents. We are this far away from starting, and we can't build them because there is a freeze on infrastructure capacity.
Yeah, yeah. This is through water care. Yeah, well, you've neatly hit upon because it's all fine to talk about land supply, that's very important, but you've neatly hit upon the other really important part of the housing dilemma, which is infrastructure funding and financing. So we've got a lot of complicated work underway around that right now, so I don't want to get ahead of where we're getting to. We'll have some more stuff to say about it soon. The reforms we're making around water and funding and financing for water infrastructure are really important. But it's not just about water, it's also about letting councils have the tools to recover the costs of infrastructure. The thing is though, there's no free lunch, right? So it costs money to build infrastructure to support houses. And the question is, who pays for that infrastructure? Who pays for growth? And our attitude as a government is that the people who are the beneficiaries of that growth should be the primary payers of the infrastructure required to support that growth. So easy principle. Most people go, oh yeah, that makes sense. If you move into a house, you should pay for the infrastructure required to support it. Otherwise, you end up being cross-subsidised by other ratepayers who don't get the benefit of that infrastructure. They might get some of the trunk infrastructure, but the sort of local roads and other infrastructure required. People go, that all sounds sort of sensible. Operationalising it's quite tricky. So watch the space. But it is going to take some time to embed that into our planning system and into our infrastructure funding and financing system. And councils, if there were councils here, to probably ask them in the room, they'd say to you, we need broader and more enhanced tools. So it's partly about the work we're doing through Local Water Done Well, which is our water reforms, which pick up, Kieran's here, he might disagree, but I'm just going to assert this, broadly pick up on the thrust of where the last government was going without some of the without some elements of it. Moving water into a economically cost-regulated structure where water pricing is regulated through the Commerce Commission, and you make much greater use of price, which goes to that point around growth, paying for growth. Water quality standards set by Te Mata Arawa, the water quality regulator, and then economic regulation. And so that's sort of one part of it, but then on the broader infrastructure funding and financing settings, we are, as I say, doing quite a lot of work on that, and I can't tell you everything right now, but it's very exciting.
In the interests of democracy, has someone else got the app open? Because I know you've been voting for questions, and I feel like that's a good way to go, because, Chris, can you help me out here? And your team say you need to go, but I'm going to...
We'll take a few more. The big end of town can wait.
Sorry to put you on the spot, Chris, but is there one there? Oh, yeah, go.
The gap between social housing rent and private market rent.
Yeah.
Can the government give an assurance that they're not rising that 25% because the people that are living there are already finding it hard enough? Yeah, so that when you spoke about my concern was, oh, shivers, are you going to raise that to try and balance it out? Is there an assurance that it's not going to happen? Because if it does happen, people existing on benefits or low incomes, obviously that's going to create another problem.
Yeah, it's not our focus. Our focus is on looking at the support across the continuum, right from IRS and accommodation biggest cost is actually accommodation supplement. It's a really important social support mechanism. So that's not our focus. Our focus is on trying to look at, is there a better way of delivering more houses and better social support, and in particular social mobility for people across the continuum. So there's a range of different things we're looking at. So I don't want to get too far ahead of that.
Is that one of them?
What's that?
Raising the threshold?
No, it's not our focus.
Okay. Over here, green.
You talked about leveling the playing field between KO and CHIPS. I just wondered if the reforms also support council and CCOs in building new houses.
So a question around the role of local government and council-controlled
Yeah.
organisations. Are you talking about the exclusion from IRRS or something else?
Well, no, just not necessarily that. We could talk about a little playing field, but perhaps alternative ways of accessing funding or having access to the financial you were talking about.
Yeah. Well, I'll just be honest with you. Council housing, so council social housing, is an interesting use of ratepayers' capital. And, generally, council housing is not maintained very well. And I'm not saying that people who live in council houses, I'm not having a go at them, I'm not having a go at the history of it, but I think there are more effective ways to deliver social and community housing to people than councils doing it, and the Wellington experience demonstrates that. So we haven't had a deep look at council housing or anything like that. I'm not before everyone gets too carried away. I'm not signalling that we're going on a drive to eradicate it or anything like that. It is what it is. It's largely historical, and different councils do different things. Like Dunedin City Council's got a huge stock of social houses, for example. Palmerston North's got quite a bit. But I'm just saying, is that a great use of ratepayer funds? Like at the moment, Lower Hutt City Council's got an urban development company that's going around building houses, including market houses. Okay, that's interesting. There's plenty of other private developers in Lower Hutt building houses as well. And Lower Hutt's rates went up 18% last year, so it's interesting.
We're pleased to report that we're seeing local government and territorial local authorities stepping up recently in ways that they haven't before, in terms of the levers and the things they have within their span of control, things like speeding up consenting, sometimes waiving development contributions, sometimes releasing strategic land assets. So there's a lot of things local government can do.
Oh, there's a lot of things they can do. In fact, most of the problems in the council, our planning system are caused by blockages at a council level. That's partly why we're going so hard on housing growth reforms and our planning reforms. So my focus is get councils back to consenting houses. It shouldn't take months and months and months to consent community housing. Well, it's nuts. It's a real cost to you. Most importantly, it's a real cost to the person who's waiting to get into that social house. Or weeks and weeks and weeks for code compliance certificates, where the houses are literally built and sit there empty while someone lives in a motel who could be in a house. It's nuts. So they should sort that out before they start building houses.
One more.
Okay, one more.
Jill Hawkey here on the front.
One more before
There
I
we
say
go.
something that'll get
Go
me
on,
on the
speak
news.
into the mic, because this.
Minister, you've talked about maintaining the momentum
Yep.
for house building, and our experience is there is no momentum in the community housing sector at the moment, that we had a pipeline of 50 houses that were all set to go, that had had their opportunity reviews done by the ministry, and they're all on hold. So I don't know how you can talk about maintaining momentum.
Yeah, well, okay, well, we can take that up with the ministry, but I mean, there are houses being built right now, including by Kainga Ora and CHIPS. I get invited to openings regularly. Can't always go. Tama Potaka often goes, but we can follow that up. I mean, there's money there. We want you building, and what I've announced today is 3 short-term things that will help with the finance. And then looking, as I say, at credit enhancement as well, which is a more medium to longer term thing, which will lower the cost to debt, so we get that neutrality between you and Kāinga Ora. But there's plenty of money in the system, and we want you building because we've all got a housing crisis we have to tackle together.
Minister, we agree with you. Housing is a moral issue, and we don't want to stop you from your next meeting, which
Okay,
is all
very
about
good.
creating
Thank
more
you
of
for
them.
your
So
time.
please, thank you,
Appreciate it.
thank you,
Thanks,
Minister.
mate.
Thank you for coming.